Hi, I'm Brian Schroff from Beyondware. I've been using Beyond Typicals for over a year now, so I wanted to put this video together to share with you my top 10 tips for using the software. These tips should help both new and experienced users be more efficient and maximize the communication benefits you can get by using Beyond Typicals for your transportation projects. Let's dive in. Tip number 1 is to not drop your sections below a height of 0. You'll see here I've got a highway section, and let's say I want to create a ditch here between these two shoulders. So I might come into my sections and pick fill slopes. Let's do a fill slope 2 and put it between those two sections. I'll duplicate that and flip one. And let's say we'd even put a flat slope between those right there. So you see these sections are too high. I may be tempted to take this section, which has a height of 0, and drop it down so that its edge meets the shoulder. And I might be tempted to drop the flat slope even further to match the top surface of those fill slopes. So I can type in those exact values. So you'll see here that top surface is now flush as it works across that ditch. However, you'll see this bottom edge. These bottom edges will drop if you send your section below 0. That creates kind of a disjointed look. The best practice here is instead build up from your lowest section. So if this is my lowest section, you see that bottom edge is the lowest. I can set that to 0 and then raise everything else up so that it matches that height. So let's do a height of 2. So now I know this can be 2 as well. And now this shoulder needs to be up to 2.5 to be flush. And you'll see that when everything is at least a height of 0, that bottom edge remains consistent. It's a much cleaner look for your typical section. And now I do know that all of these other sections need to go up to match that shoulder height of 2.5. A very quick way to do that is to go to your section hierarchy and select all of those lanes. I can press Control on the keyboard and select those common lanes, then come over here and pick my shoulders and common lanes, and now I can set that height for those sections all at once with a 2.5. So there we get our sections all up, and we keep that nice clean look at the bottom. One other tip on this, if you do set your sections below 0, let's go ahead and undo that change, that the pavement markings, even if they're locked to the section, do not drop with the section. So you'll see I can bring this down, and that pavement marking that's between those two common lanes, even though it's locked to this lane, if I raised it up, that pavement marking goes up, but this is just a limitation in Beyond Typicals where the pavement markings don't drop below 0. So just a best practice to not ever send your sections below 0. You'll get a much cleaner look across the bottom, and your pavement markings will behave as expected. Tip number 2 is one that I've noted in our striping support video, but what I want to encourage users to do when they add striping is to use our shortcuts to do it. We have this quick action called Surround with Striping, where you can select by right-clicking on a section and then clicking that option. Otherwise, you could click S on your keyboard. This is the way I typically add striping. What I'm going to do first is duplicate this section, and I'm going to have my hierarchy open. So you'll see when I pulled in that common lane, by default it has stripes on the left and right, and they're linked to that common lane. Pretty often I'm using multi-lane roads, so I'll duplicate a section. There's a few different ways you can do that with this button here. You can right-click and say duplicate, or do Control-D on your keyboard. I like to use keyboard shortcuts whenever I can, so I'll do Control-D. Let's say we're working on a 6-lane highway and we've got 3 lanes in one direction. You'll see in the hierarchy that right stripe became unlinked because the common lanes that I duplicated populated right next in that series. So now what I need to do is add striping between these lanes. There's a few different ways to do that, like there are a lot of things in Beyond Typicals. One is to use this Add Striping button here at the top, And then we also have a section type in this list. There's a striping section down here at the bottom. These two buttons are basically the exact same thing, where you can click it, and then similar to bringing in any other element into your section, you can then snap that into place between two sections. I normally don't do this, and there's a couple of reasons for that. One is if all of my sections are raised. Let's say I followed tip 1 and I have a lower section somewhere, so all of my sections are at height 1. And before I do that, I'll delete that stripe. So let's make all 3 of these sections 1. Now when I bring that stripe in, I don't see it because when I'm pulling it in, I've actually got it active. It's displaying in the model at height 0. It's not actively detecting the surface and showing me where I put it. So I'm going to click right here between lane 2 and 3, and then I'll show you that it was placed in the hierarchy. It's right there, but it's down at elevation 0. I could see it if I then link it to one of the common lanes around it. By clicking that, you'll see that stripe automatically jumps up to the surface of this common lane. When I move that section higher, because it's linked to this common lane here on the right, it's going to stay along the surface of that lane. If I link it to the section on the left, you'll see it jump down to lane number 2. So it's kind of tedious, and you can lose your striping if you use those add striping buttons here. So generally, my tip here is to add striping with that shortcut, where you can right-click and use the Surround with Striping quick action, or even faster, I like to just press S on my keyboard. I'm going to first return this section back down to 1, and let's go ahead and delete all the stripes here. And I'll leave my hierarchy open so that you can see what happens. Basically, if I select a section and press S on my keyboard, I've now created 2 linked stripes to that section. So it'll put one on the left and on the right. If I take another section that has a stripe on its left, and I press S, it will only add a linked stripe to the side that doesn't have a stripe on it. So those 2 original stripes here on lane 1 stay linked to lane 1, and by pressing S on lane 2, I'm getting another linked stripe to lane 2. So you'll see when I raise this section, my stripe on the right of lane 2 stays with it, and because these stripes were linked to lane 1, they're going to stay down there. So by pressing S, you're not losing any striping, you're just kind of adding them into your section. And especially if you have those elevations raised higher, if you use that add striping button, you're not going to see it. It's going to be a little bit harder to place. In tip number 3, I want to show you a couple of different features in Beyond Typicals to help you with precise asset placement. Now, some assets that you bring in, like trees and shrubs, don't need to be placed terribly specifically, but in this case, for this example project, I want to add in an asphalt connection between this crosswalk and the shared use path. And we do have a few different building blocks in here that I can use in our asset menu to place those. So I can search for asphalt. And I can use this slab and this asphalt arc piece to basically build in that connection. So I'll bring in an asphalt slab and focus on this rectangle piece first. But there's 2 different features I want to talk about here. One is when you select an asset, you'll open this asset placement menu on the left where you can very specifically adjust the location coordinates, the rotation, and the scale of the asset that you've selected. So pay attention to this menu because you can use this to be very precise on your location. For instance, if I want this just over the surface, I can set that Z location to -15. I also want to show that you can use the 2D camera mode to get very precise placement and just focus on 2 dimensions at a time. So in this case, I'll select a top view of my 2D camera mode, and I can use this mode to just focus on the left, right, and up, down location of this asphalt square. I can also use it to adjust the scale. So here I want to transform this so this asphalt edge touches the roadway shoulder and the shared use path. So I can use this view just to focus on making sure that I place this in the right location and scale it correctly to fit that gap between those 2 elements. it's a little bit off over here, so I can use that menu to adjust the Y direction very specifically and incrementally to get it to touch. So there it looks like that negative 92 value in the Y direction has got it to fit. I'll go ahead and look at the front view and check this asset out. And just looking at this, I do see it in 3D mode, but I barely see it at all in this 2D front view. So that's a really good spot for it, where it's just hovering over the surface so that it covers up that gravel shoulder and that dirt clear zone. I'll go ahead and place the other asphalt pieces here and use that same asset placement menu to adjust the location, rotation, and scale of these pieces. And then I'll use that 2D camera mode to line those up as well. One other thing I want to note here is when you do get a location that might be consistent for a couple of different assets on a section, for instance, on this asphalt piece, that Y location of this coordinate here at 244, I'm probably going to want that down here on this one as well. So I'll rotate this piece into place, so that'll be 270. And then if I adjust the X direction, let's go up to there. I think if I set that Y coordinate right at 244 as well, it's going to hit that exact same spot along the edge of the shared use path. I'm also going to adjust the scale upwards to match the other asset. Again, matching the 2X and Y scale as the radius on the north edge. And now I'll check my 3D view and see that those objects are too high, so I can go back to 2D view, front view, select that section. There they are sitting above the ground. I can take that and move that back down and use that -15 that I did with the asphalt rectangle. And then I can head to 3D view to just check and make sure that those look the way I want them to. And there we go. So definitely capitalizing on your 2D view to precisely place those assets, and then going to that asset placement menu to adjust location, rotation, and scale are great ways to get those assets into your model in the exact orientation you want them. Tip number 4 is for our users that are trying to render out screenshot images of their models and want to pause traffic so you're not getting that motion blur associated with rendering when traffic is moving. But for those of our newer users that are more familiar with this traffic play pause button in the bottom right, they might be using that traffic pause to globally pause traffic and aren't aware that you can actually pause on a lane-by-lane basis. So when you select a section with moving traffic, in the traffic menu right at the top, there's a pause traffic button where you can pause those lanes individually. So you can wait for the right kind of traffic mix and placement. So when you press that global pause button, you're not cutting off vehicles or getting duplicates if you want to have that realism in your model. So what you can do is just basically wait per lane and wait for the right vehicle mix to show up, and then pause that lane. And that works for sidewalks and bike lanes and all lanes with moving traffic. You can do a mix as well. So if you got most of your lanes paused and then you wanted to pause sidewalks and all the remaining lanes, you can also use those in conjunction with each other. Pressing play will just unpause those lanes that aren't individually paused. And then to unpause the traffic in those other lanes, you do need to select them and go back and unpause those. One tip here, though, is that when you do change phases or save and exit a file and come back, our traffic does not save in place. So I can move to a different phase and move back, and now you'll see that I don't have any vehicles populating in those lanes because those are individually paused. So I do need to go back and unpause those. Potentially in the future, we might be adding in a feature to Beyond Typicals that lets you pause traffic in place and have it save when you exit a file, but currently that's a limitation as of version 2.4. One way to compensate for that is to pause or turn off traffic and then place static vehicles. So I can place a static pickup truck and a static school bus, and we have some other vehicles as well. We have just a static vehicle mix that will randomize as you place them. So you could place those specifically into place in your model. If you're only looking at screenshot renderings and you don't want moving traffic, you can always use this option to place vehicles so that when you do change phases or save and exit and return, those vehicles will be in place where you place them. Tip number 5 is the first of a couple where I suggest you envision your final product before you start modeling in Beyond Typicals. And specifically for this tip, it's to set your section length before you really start modeling, especially before you start adjusting primary and secondary assets and placing assets in your model. And the reason being for this is if I were to change this section length after I put everything into place, let's say I come back and think that I want this road to look 3 times as long. So let's go ahead and adjust that to 600 feet. You'll see that a lot of those assets that I've placed no longer work where they're located. Specifically on this building section on the left, you'll see that I've got this multifamily buildings asset set as the primary asset, spaced at 90 feet. And the reason for that was so I could create some gaps between them. So I could put some other buildings like this church and this cafe. And you'll see I've got some other placed assets here like plant pots with plants in them. If I change the section length, those placed assets will generally stay in the same spot they were placed, while other things around them may move out of place and now make those placed assets look a little wonky. So ultimately, if I would have started at 600 feet, I could have placed those assets the first time in the position I want them to and eliminate some rework that would come with making that section length change after the fact. The other part of this is you'll see that I've got a bunch of moving traffic in this section. Sometimes when I change the section length, that traffic mix, whether it's the speed or the types of vehicles or the volume of them, can look a little bit different. Where I have a volume of 33 on this lane, and at 200 feet, this road didn't look nearly as congested. But now with that longer section length, I have these vehicles populating. It looks like there's a lot more traffic on the road, so I would maybe want to adjust other traffic settings and other elements in this model just to accommodate that section length. So setting that section length early to accommodate a rendered screenshot or a video, whether you're using photo compositing or not, having that section length set early is going to eliminate a lot of that rework that might come from making those adjustments further down the road. Tip 6 is a little similar to the previous tip in that envisioning and knowing the outputs you want to get from Beyond Typicals before you start rendering is going to save time toward the end of your project workflow. And specifically for this tip, it's to pay attention to the quality settings and turning on this preview aspect ratio toggle before you start rendering out your screenshots or videos from Beyond Typicals. You'll notice in the quality section, we have a few different shortcuts for resolutions. So we have 1080p, 4K, and 8K. And you'll see as I change between those, all it's doing is changing the X and Y resolution, where on the low end, a 1080p is going to be a lower definition image or video, but it's going to take a lot less time to render, and it's ultimately going to be a smaller file size. On the other side, 8K is going to be a lot higher definition, but that file size will be pretty large, and it's going to take a little bit more time to render. For something like a public meeting where you're blowing up an image on a poster board, that 4K and 8K quality shortcut could be a good option. The reason you should turn on this preview aspect ratio is to see what's actually going to be rendered from Beyond Typicals. When I turn this off and on now, you're not seeing any changes in my model view, but that's because my monitor is the same 16x by 9y ratio of these resolution shortcuts, where if I started changing the output to maybe be a square, so I'll change this to 1920 to match the X, you'll see I'm getting these black bars on the left and right sides. That's Beyond Typicals showing me that the output is just going to be this square, and those black bars won't actually be included in that image or video render. Conversely, if I wanted something like a panoramic view, I could increase my X or decrease my Y, and what I'll get from there is a shorter and wider image or video than the 16:9 default shortcuts. When I have that preview aspect ratio setting toggled off, if I make any changes to that resolution, you'll see my model view goes unchanged, and I wouldn't actually see the effect of those changes until I toggle that on. So having that toggled on is going to help you preview your output and help you frame up your model and position your camera before you render your image or video. Tip number 7 is pretty straightforward, and that's simply to use the section hierarchy. I often find myself using the hierarchy when I'm modeling because it's a great place to stay organized and find elements I might have lost track of when I'm modeling, or selecting elements like stripes or free pipes or things that might be hard to choose or click on in model view. So it's a great place to do things like that. It's also very functional, where you can adjust the striping linkages to make sure that they're showing up on those lanes that are next to them. You can also move sections within here by clicking and dragging. You can rename sections by double clicking on them. And I find this upside down triangle icon really helpful that shows you if you've placed an asset on that section. So that can really help you find those objects that you might have placed in the model and moved away from that section that you placed them on if you need to come back and find them to edit them later. So you'll see in this shoulder section, I don't have an asset placed there, but I do have this manhole round 5 asset that was originally placed on that section and moved away. So seeing that icon is going to help you go find those placed assets so that you can make changes to those later. There's some other great functionality in the hierarchy as well, where you can control click on multiple sections to adjust all of those heights at the same time. That's a function that's only available within the hierarchy. And you can create folders within your section hierarchy so that you can tuck different section elements underneath a single folder. And what that's going to let you do is click once on that folder to select multiple sections. I can also take whole groups of those by just clicking and dragging on that folder and moving those around, or adjusting the heights simultaneously, all very quickly using that folder organization. So there's a lot of great functionality built into the hierarchy that you can use to help stay organized and to make quick edits to a lot of sections at a time in your model. In the future, this is a section where we're hoping to improve the user experience, maybe add some additional features like more mass editing than just heights of the section. So stay tuned for future version updates, which may have some improvements here in the hierarchy. Tip number 8 is to capitalize on the fact that you're building this 3D world and dive into your model and start looking at what you've built from a lot of different perspectives. And these can create some really unique and powerful visualizations if you move the camera into the position of a person that might be walking on the sidewalk or riding in a bike lane or getting on a bus. You're now able to very quickly and easily create those visualizations from a lot of different viewpoints within your 3D model. And our camera settings even help you enhance some of that and refer back to those. For one, you can increase the field of view, which gives you a little bit more of a pedestrian type style of camera lens where you can see some more peripheral images. And you can even set those cameras into motion. So I can set a relative transform of world and forward, and then position my camera into place so that it actually moves like I'm looking at my project as a person walking on the sidewalk. Or I could go move over into the bike lane and increase that panning speed, let's say 30, maybe up to 40, and get a sense for what does this look like if I'm a person on the bike moving through the corridor. So there's a lot of great stuff you can do with our cameras. And like I said, you can refer back to them. So if you save those camera positions, even if they're in movement, you see I've got a pan bikeway and a pan sidewalk. I can refer back to those, just reloading that camera position, and go ahead and render out a video so that I can deliver something that speaks to this project and this user of the roadway. That can be really powerful in project communications. You'll see here I've also got some orbit options, both down on the street view in that concrete median, as well as over the top. There's also some options for top-down views. I think this is a really cool view, especially for engineers that might be more used to thinking in plan view and seeing that from the top down. I think there's a lot of cool stuff that you can do with your camera positions and then folding those into your rendered outputs to create some really cool, powerful visualizations that can communicate your design to many different types of people that use and design and manage the roadway. This is also something you can do with photo compositing. You need to keep that camera static, but as long as you're grabbing images from different viewpoints around your project, you can layer multiple images and save multiple camera viewpoints within your Beyond Typicals model so that you can use different viewpoints with that photo compositing feature. And I think this example is a really good one where we have this more aerial view of that roadway construction project down there under the bridge, and then we can turn off those images and turn on an image from that bridge and load up a saved camera to view that project from a different viewpoint. So this is something you can do with photo compositing as well, and that can be a very effective way to visualize your project from those different viewpoints. Tip number 9 is one that I've referenced in a couple other videos, but thought I'd call it out specifically here as well. And that is when I'm cleaning up labels, I often find the need to insert a single vertical leader line somewhere between sections in my model. This most often happens when I'm trying to combine labels over the top of multiple sections. So in this case, if I want the bus lane dimensioned to the face of curb, I want this to represent 12 feet, which would incorporate the 11-foot bus lane and 1-foot gutter. And in order to do that, I'm going to have to turn off vertical leader lines for the bus side and the gutter side to get rid of that division between those two sections. Similarly, if I wanted to get rid of this division between the 4.25-foot amenity zone and the 0.75-foot curb so that I can have a 5-foot dimension over the top of that, or if I've got two sidewalk pieces to show pedestrians moving in two different directions, I would want to turn off vertical leaders to be able to combine the label for an 8-foot wide sidewalk. So when I start doing that, I need to turn off vertical leader lines of both sides of that division because each section label has a left and right edge. So I need to turn off the leader lines for this grass section to get rid of the right edge. And I need to turn off the vertical leader lines of the curb to get rid of that left side. So when I start turning these off, I'm getting rid of all my vertical leader lines. So first I'm going to make the adjustments to those labels. There we go. So now I've overridden those labels, but now I need to insert vertical leader lines so that I see divisions between those critical points. And the way to do that is to use an invisible section. So that's all the way at the bottom of our section list. You'll see when you bring this in, you can place it between two sections, and it comes with vertical leader lines on the left and right edge. And all you need to do is set the width of that section to 0, and now you've got two vertical leader lines right over the top of each other that sit between any sections in your model. And in this case, I've got one here between the curb and the gutter. And in my hierarchy, I can see that. And if I did need to place this in other places, I could either take another section and place it in the model and change its width, or I could simply go to my hierarchy and duplicate that section and then move it to where I want to. So I want one on the far left edge, and I want to duplicate it again and move it between the sidewalk and boulevard section here. So now I've divided up those sections where I had to turn off those vertical leader lines. You'll see that this vertical leader line is a little short. That's because I must have moved my section labels a little bit higher than the default height. In that case, all I need to do is go to that invisible section and change my label height up or down. You'll see that extension as I make that height adjustment. This is also a nice way to make it look like how engineers label plans, where that vertical leader line is actually extended a little bit higher than the dimension line. So in that case, all you need to do is increase the label height of those invisible section labels to achieve that look. Tip number 10 also has to do with labeling your typical section, because oftentimes those section labels can be one of the more critical components of what you're trying to communicate with your visualization. I've had some users ask for some advice on how to make these labels a little bit more legible because our Barlow condensed font, that's the default, can appear a little bit squished together. So we do have a couple other options that do just appear to be a little less squished and maybe a little bit more legible. You can also move those labels forward. So if that text does appear a little bit small, just moving them closer to the camera, closer to the front of the model, can be a little bit easier to read that way too. You can also play with the text color or the label color or the leader line color in those settings. And then if you do like that change, you can always save that setting change as a default. So all those settings here in this section are now the default label. If I added new sections to this model, they would all be labeled in that same fashion. And then I can also load that new default to other lanes that are already placed in the model. I can also globally apply that default to all the section labels in the model, but you'll see when I do that, it may change settings on some sections I don't want changed. So mileage may vary depending on applying that to all your sections, or on a section by section basis is going to be more efficient, but those options are there. I'm going to go ahead and finish updating the rest of these labels to match those new settings, and then we can compare this to a similar model with those default labels that we had to begin with. So now you can see when I select a different phase, we can see those previous labels that just by moving those labels forward and changing the font, we've made those a lot easier to read. You also have a couple of other options. You could always turn your labels off and replace them with a custom label, but our custom label can be a little bit cumbersome to edit, but I can quickly show how I can make my own label to sit over the top of this lane, and in that case, I do have the option of changing the font size. So there we go. We have a custom label there that you can adjust things like transparency and size and font. But again, it can be a little bit cumbersome to create, and we don't yet have a copy and paste function to be able to duplicate this really easily. So in that case, another thing I like to advise is if you do want custom labels where our section labels just aren't working for you, you could just globally turn those off. In our settings, we have a disable section labels. And in this case, you could just render out an image without labels, place it into a software like Adobe or Bluebeam or PowerPoint or Microsoft Word, and use those software applications' labeling functionality to add in your own labels. You could also join this with an option where you have your section labels on, but you've individually turned off just the labels above those sections. That would keep those vertical leader lines in there to divide up your sections, and then have a rendered image with those leader lines as a divider where you could add your own labels in a post-processing workflow. So those are my tips for using Beyond Typicals, but if you have any of your own, feel free to leave them in the comments. We'd love to hear them. If you found this video useful, I recommend you subscribe to the Beyondware YouTube channel to stay up to date with more helpful videos like this one for using our software. Also, you can join us at our Beyond Typicals user group on LinkedIn, and there's plenty more at beyondware.com. Thanks for watching.